Hi guys, hope everything's going well for you. Hope you've had a good week so far under the circumstances. We are going to continue our discussion of World War One from the U.S. perspective. Remember, we talked about kind of the causes, the factors that went into getting the United States into war. Now you've declared war, you're in it, right? 1917, Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war, and they voted to do so against Germany. Now you have to go fight the war. And so, really, what you have to have is you need to start preparing to fight this war. So obviously there was some measures taken before this, because a world war had been waging for roughly 3 years at this point, but we are still desperately, desperately behind when it comes to our ability to make war at this time. And so one of the things that we have to do, one of those four factors to winning the war, is we have to uh, get money. We have to uh, raise enough money to fund this war. So, guys, wars are very expensive, and we're going to end up spending $32 billion before it's all said and done in World War One. That's cheap compared to nowadays, but uh, we have to raise the money to do that. So there's really two ways that uh, the government comes up with that money. One is through taxes. So they raise taxes on the new income tax, raise the rates on the new income tax. So the income tax guys had only been around for a couple of years at this point. And then they also increased taxes on corporations, which we hadn't seen a lot of. Remember, guys, even though we've gone through the progressive era and we've kind of held corporations and companies more accountable, the wealthy more accountable, the government is still pretty loath to get involved with corporations. So this was pretty out of the ordinary, but this is an extraordinary time where you are fighting a world war, and so kind of sacrifices have to be made. And then also, guys, they're going to put an extra tax on arms manufacturers as well, which makes sense. They're pouring money into this, and so they're saying, hey, you're not just going to make out like bandits from the United States government. You need to do your part as Americans as well. And then the second way that they're going to try and raise that money is through bonds. And so a government bond, guys, is basically a way for the government to get people to lend it money. All right, that's essentially what you're doing when you buy a government bond. And so the government guys, they kind of marketed these bonds as Liberty bonds or Victory bonds, which obviously they chose those names for a reason. It kind of brings out this patriotism for people of, hey, you are doing your part to help us win this war by buying these bonds. And so that's a big way that they raise money as well. Like I said, it's essentially people, citizens loaning money to the government because there's going to be a fixed time period for this bond. Once you hit that time period, whether it's a 5-year bond, a 10-year bond, whatever, whenever you hit that time limit, you can basically sell the government back your bond, and they will repay you your original money plus interest, is the idea. Okay. So you make that money back plus interest. So that's one thing they have to do. They also need to produce supplies, a lot of supplies. Okay, and this is very important because if you don't have a well-supplied army, a well-supplied military, it's going to be very hard to win. We talked about that last year with Napoleon Bonaparte's failures as a general. Is the only time he failed was when he had long supply lines. He couldn't keep his troops supplied. So you have to have those supplies in place, guys. One of the ways that they're going to try and get those supplies up is by managing resources and trying to up our production of war supplies. Okay, and so one way that we're going to do that, a big way that we're going to do that, is with the creation of the War Industries Board. And so this was a group of agencies. It was headed up by a former stockbroker who kind of knew the ins and outs of these big businesses. And basically, they tried to play traffic cop and say, okay, you're going to get these raw materials. Okay, hold on. You need to be producing less of this, producing more of this, because this is what we need for the war effort. So they're trying to really regulate all of that so it's not a piecemeal, hey, everybody's doing their own thing. And so now we have all these shortages of especially raw materials. So that was a big part of it, guys. You also had the National War Labor Board. And so they were in charge of the labor force of this country and making sure that they were working, okay, that they were not striking. And so a way that they tried to do that was to really support the unions and really kind of pressure businesses and companies into getting higher wages for laborers. Okay, so to make sure that there's no work stoppages, because a work stoppage during this war could be catastrophic if you're not, like I said, getting the supplies that your military needs. So it's basically, hey, we can't have that. But they cited, this is kind of where we saw progressivism guys come into play. They actually sided with the laborers this time around. And so this is going to be very important. It's going to help kind of build the power and legitimacy of labor unions in this country because of it. And then also, guys, the government's trying to ration food and fuel and supplies at home as well. And so basically trying to convince the American people without upsetting them, because you want to have your citizens happy and supportive of the war, not mad because the government's saying we're banning you from these things. So it was more to get them to support it, to be patriotic, and so try and convince Americans to use less of those things, use less fuel, use less food, so that way it can be diverted to the war, to the troops. And so the fuel administration guys, they're going to try some different tactics with that. They're going to try and decrease the amount of fuel used at home by introducing daylight savings time. And so that's obviously what we're in now. This is where daylight savings time came from. And so if you don't like having to get up an hour earlier, I guess you can thank the men and women of the fuel administration for that. But that was one way to do that, to try and increase productivity without using as much fuel. They also shortened the work week for manufacturers that were not specifically producing war materials, to try and use less fuel that way, as far as coal. So this is mostly coal and oil. They also introduced the idea of heatless Mondays. The Food Administration, headed up by Herbert Hoover, who he's going to become president eventually and does a good job. Obviously, a good enough job that he's going to be able to kind of put this on his resume. It's going to be headed up by him. He's going to come up with this idea of, hey, Americans, don't go out and buy these vegetables. We need them for the troops. Grow your own vegetables. Create a victory garden. Once again, you have that idea of victory coming into play to increase the patriotism of it. Hey, this is going to help win us the war. This is why you should do this. He's also going to come up with these ideas of wheatless Mondays, where you don't eat wheat, so we can set more aside for the troops. Meatless Tuesdays, porkless Thursdays, right? So anything they can do to kind of ration things without specifically saying, okay, we're going to take these things away from you, because you have to have the support of your people to really be successful. Okay, number three, guys, the third factor is manpower. Obviously, um, wars can't be won without soldiers. Just ask Captain America if you're a Marvel fan, right? Wars are won by soldiers, and so that's what you have to have, right? You have to have that manpower in place. Unfortunately for the United States, and this is where one of the big areas where we were behind the eight ball, guys, is um, at this time we had never had a true standing army. It was a standing army, but it was very small. We would um, basically have a volunteer effort where people would volunteer when anything came up, and the ranks would swell in the military. And then, okay, uh, crisis averted or war won, whatever, the war's over, everybody goes back home, and our military really shrinks way down. And so this is what's going to continue to happen in our history. And so at this point, we don't have much of a military. And so we really need that manpower to boost our numbers up for the military to compete over in Europe, where you have these European armies that are 8, 9 million strong. Okay, and so obviously one way that we're going to get those troops is through volunteers. You're going to have over 2 million Americans volunteer for World War One for service. And the rest, guys, we're going to get through a draft. We're going to have a draft. We're going to draft people and say, you are of fighting age. You are now in the military. If you do not report, you will go to jail. Now, a lot of people in the government, guys, thought conscription, which was at the time a big thing in Europe, where, hey, basically, if you're a male, you can just expect to have to serve so many years in the military. That's, for them, was, hey, that's un-American. That's not democracy. That's not the freedoms that we support here in the United States. And so we're not going to do that. We're not going to have conscription, but we're going to create a selective service, is what it's called. So this is a system for drafting people into the army, into the military. Okay, and so how they set it up to make it more democratic, I guess, is they created thousands of local draft boards. They would have basically a lottery where there's literally these lottery balls, and your number comes up. Anyone who has that number, you've been drafted. And then the local draft boards would review that and say, no, this person shouldn't go into service. Okay, this person, they can go into service. That won't ruin our local community if we don't have a ditch digger. It might ruin our local community if we have one doctor in the area and our doctor just got drafted. So that's the thing behind that, guys. Ultimately, you're going to have about 2.8 million soldiers drafted. And an offshoot of this, an impact of this, guys, is this creates opportunities, right? You have over 4 million men that are drafted into the military. Not all of them, obviously, are going to make their way to Europe, but they're still in the military, and so they aren't able to serve in the manufacturing industries and things like that. And that opens the way, guys, for African Americans to come in, and you have what is known as the Great Migration, where all these African Americans from the South are going to leave the South and move into the North to fill those manufacturing. Because, guys, remember, even at this point, the South does not really have much in the way of manufacturing. They're still very agrarian, and so most of these manufacturing jobs are in the North. And so they leave the South, they leave their homes there, they leave Jim Crow, and they come to the North to take over these vacated factory jobs. There's also going to be a greater opportunity for women. Not only will women be able to serve kind of in the capacity of as a nurse or something like that, but also they're going to have more opportunities in the regular workforce